So with everything going on in the last 2 years with the OGL debacle, weird monetization strategies from Wizards of the Coast, and just the natural inclination in people wanting a change of pace, there's a lot of people looking for new games to play, and I have a perfect system for those looking to get away from D&D. But before we get into Shadow the Demon Lord, I feel like I should make my stance clear on where I stand with D&D 5e, since it's something that is going to be an unavoidable subject when talking about this system. I ended up disparaging it way more in the script than I intend to when I first set out to make this video, but I want to make it clear that these criticisms are coming from somebody who played it for years, and not the shrill screeching from a hipster trying to gatekeep their precious hobby. I might end up repeating some stuff from my Shadow the Weird Wizard's first impressions video, and I want to say thank you to my patrons for voting on this video topic. Now, if you don't care what I have to say about D&D 5e and just want to go straight to the Shadow the Demon Lord content, go this time code or skip to the next chapter. I came into the hobby through 5e. I was interested in D&D, and a friend of mine who was already in the hobby introduced my other friends and I to it. I played it for about 3 years, and in that time I found myself running into a lot of issues with it. I did have a lot of fun at first, but the more I played it and the more I learned about the greater RPG hobby, the more I soured on 5e until eventually I told my group that I wanted to run other stuff like Call of Cthulhu and Dungeons & Crawl Classics. I haven't looked back, and every time I've played 5e since then was because somebody in my friend group really wanted to play it, and I didn't mind doing it. I'm kind of past that now, and will more than likely never play 5e again outside of Baldur's Gate 3. However, I think D&D 5e is a good system. It does what it's designed to do well. It's a tactical, squad-based monster-killing game, and I think it gets the job done. I personally don't think it does much else well, but do not take that as me saying your social murder mystery campaign or your Great Gatsby 5e hack game is bad or wrong or not fun. If you enjoyed it, I'm not here to tell you you didn't. RPGs are great because you can do so much with them despite the rules and design theory, as long as you have the right mindset, group, and put in the correct amount of effort. I don't want to play 5e, but I don't hate it. Is r/D&D meme some of the most unfunny shit I've ever seen? Absolutely. Have the amount of terrible players I've run into since leaving 5e dropped by like 99%? Yeah, you betcha. However, I find the people in the niche circles who vehemently hate 5e just as incredibly annoying as the people who scream about how GMs need to make balanced encounters on Reddit. 5e is what got me and a bunch of other people into the hobby, and as frustrating as it is seeing so many fantastic systems, scenarios, and creators just fester in obscurity under its shadow, it is the reason why so many people trickled out of it and into whatever niche you may find yourself in now, and why so many creators can have some level of a career from it these days. So, just to summarize, I don't hate 5e, I just don't want to play it, and I think 5e does what it is trying to do very well, and I think people on both sides who either refuse to play anything but D&D and see every other system as the bargain bin version, and people who froth at the mouth of the mere mention of D&D 5e, equally annoying. So with all that said, Shadow the Demon Lord is what 5e should have been. Shadow the Demon Lord was created by Robert J. Schwalb, who was one of the writers for 5e, and he took a lot of the design philosophy of that game that, he probably designed or designed with other people there, but was able to make something not weighed down by like 40 years of baggage. The most unfortunate part of any brand is that it has recognition to push sales, but with that comes expectations. Just look at how useless and divorced the inclusion of alignment in 5e is from its original purpose as just one of many examples of its messy execution. And if you think I'm being unfair to D&D, this is not a problem unique to it. Take Call of Cthulhu 7th edition as an example, which is a fantastic improvement over the older editions, but they still had to pull back on many of the changes they wanted to make due to perceived audience expectations. I was speaking with one of the editors for COC 7e, Scott Dorward, and he mentioned during the creation of that edition, there were several skills such as spot hidden and library use deemed too iconic to COC by some of the designers to alter too much or cut. Anyway, I have so far spent a lot of time talking about systems that aren't Shadow the Demon Lord, so what is so great about it, and why should you play it? To give you the quick and dirty version in case you don't have time to watch however long this video ends up being, I found that Shadow the Demon Lord blends story-focused fantasy gaming while still giving players loads and loads of build options and agency. The focus that the system puts on narrative is really nailed into you as you read through the core book while still delivering on absolutely fantastic and streamlined mechanics. When I ran a full campaign of this about 2 years ago, there were several times where I couldn't remember a rule and just made a ruling on the fly, and then I think after every single time pretty much, my ruling ended up being the actual rule when I checked the book later after the game. So that's the short answer. Delivering on proper character builds without sacrificing the ability to tell a shared story with tension and danger. However, as a disclaimer right now, if you're somebody who's looking for just a simple game to dungeon crawl in and play sandbox games, Shadow the Demon Lord ain't it. Demon Lord is going after the same audience of players from 3rd to 5th edition D&D, Pathfinder, and those kinds of games. Its focus is on narrative and plot-driven games with characters who gain combat abilities and become stronger and more complex as they level up. If you hated 5th edition to its core and want something completely different, I don't think Demon Lord is going to interest you. It is just a better built version of that style of game. I am not going to cover every last aspect of the system since I don't think it's necessary considering the ubiquity of fantasy RPGs at this point, but I'm going to try and cover what I find are the real highlights that make it stand out throughout this video. This game has everything you need for fans of gaming that you'd expect and then some, from traveling rules, gear, a bestiary, corruption, sanity mechanics, magic items, and lore for the base setting, amongst other things. Instead of the usual 6 attributes you may be used to from D&D and its derivatives, in Shadow of the Demon Lord you have 4 that cover the same bases of health, armor, spellcasting, skill checks, and everything else you use attributes for. They are strength, agility, intellect, and will. For the actual rolling, all you need are d20s and d6s, essentially the most common dice that people have available to them in this hobby. d20s are used for checks and combat rolls, and d6s are used for damage and as modifiers. All damage is some amount of d6s determined by whatever weapon and abilities you have that modify that. And then there are boons and banes. A boon is a d6 you add to your d20 roll, and a bane is a d6 you subtract from it. They cancel each other out 1 for 1, and you only modify your d20 roll by the highest of whichever you have. So if you are making an attack roll with 3 boons against an armored knight, but an enemy wizard casts a spell on you that gives you a bane on the attack roll, you roll 2 boons instead. Let's say you roll a 5 and a 3 on those 2 boon dice, then you add the 5 to whatever you rolled on the d20. It's an incredibly elegant system that is so easy to calculate and feels really satisfying to roll at the table. Challenge rolls are always against DC 10 or the enemy's relevant attribute for contested rolls, so it is easy to remember what the player needs to beat to pass a challenge roll. What changes are the modifiers from attributes going up with levels, and situational boons and banes from environmental factors and character abilities. As mentioned, when all you have are d6s and d20s, it makes things very streamlined, and it's kind of crazy how well the game works, while not feeling dumbed down compared to its counterparts. The only other basic thing I want to get to before we dig deeper into this game is health and damage. Health and damage are tracked separately. When the amount of damage taken equals your health, you become incapacitated. There are the rules for recovery and death and all that jazz, but I mostly just wanted to mention how they are tracked separately since that threw my group off at first. It does actually make sense and is nice adding damage that it's taken instead of subtracting health. But it's just different enough from what a lot of people coming to this game may be used to that I think it deserved a mention. Okay, that's the basic stuff out of the way. There's obviously more to the core rules, but if you've played 5e or Pathfinder or really any game that's in the D&D sphere or an offshoot, you understand that a lot of the stuff you'll be doing here will be the same, just generally executed better than some of its counterparts. So, let's just jump straight into why the system is just so fun to play. This is going to be the main draw of the system. Player satisfaction is incredibly important to a campaign sustaining itself and being fun throughout its lifespan. You can write the best story in the world, cultivate the most engrossing background music, employ your most diverse voices, and present your expertly painted minis, and it might all not matter if your players resent the system and characters they are playing. Demon Lord follows the same design philosophy as Worlds Without Number when it comes to characters, which is whatever your character decides they want to be really good at, they are good at. However, the amount of health they'll gain over the levels will never bloat to amounts that makes them unkillable. I think 5e gets a bit of a bad rap where people call the characters superheroes, and sure, they are to some extent at later levels, but it isn't hard to trounce them if you're willing to put the effort in to build dynamic and brutally fun monster encounters. But I think that superhero comparison comes from the fact that level 5 and above combats in 5e turn into extremely drawn-out slugfests like the last half of a Zack Snyder film that take forever to finish, both because of the healing abilities and hit point amount that the players have, but also the game culture of 5e being obsessed with balance. If you actually look at the abilities 5e players get, they are pretty good on the lower end levels when fighting lower level monsters, but the play culture, more so than the system, encourages this Bethesda game level scaling. This causes them to run up against creatures more suited to their level, so receiving stronger damaging abilities while growing in HP and healing just means these extended fight scenes between two bloated sides punching each other over and over until one side collapses. In Demon Lord, this pervasive community aspect around playing properly with the CR system and making fair encounters for the player builds not only doesn't really exist, I mean, there's still a lot of the min-maxers and build crafters, you're going to get that with any game, but if you look at Worlds Without Number as well as Demon Lord, you will find these people who are all here just for the build and just completely ignore the narrative elements. However, it is not nearly as pervasive as it is in 5e. What pushed me from 5e was the very, overarching and almost uniform idea of balance. People will tell you play what you want, but then when people on Reddit or Discord ask about their build idea, you will often see people give them completely different build ideas that are tangentially related, but clearly mechanically superior to the idea the person had, even if it doesn't actually really answer their question. And that was one of the main frustrations I started having with the community. And I found that that is not quite as much the case with Demon Lord. I'm not going to sit here and say that doesn't exist. It does. But it's not nearly as bad. And even if it was as bad, The players will never get so many hit points that level of balance will really change all that much in terms of the fights taking forever. I'll get into that more in the combat section of this video, but essentially having less health and not having so much balance also just naturally means the players are less inclined to meet everything they encounter with violence as the first resort. It becomes a lot more of a thing that they can't do all the time when they're not sure if they're going to leave that battlefield alive. Anyway, let's talk about the builds themselves. In Demon Lord, you don't have classes, but instead have paths. Paths are similar, except that you take them at different levels, and this means you can mix and match some really amazing combinations and come up with some extremely unique character concepts. The paths are meant to represent the skills and changes your characters gain over time from the experiences through adventuring or whatever storyline they find themselves in. Using this chart here, at level 0, you start with just your ancestry path. So that is whatever ancestry you pick between humans, clockwork, goblin, changeling, whatever, and that determines a few things such as your starting ability, stats, health, and basic things like that. At level 1, you choose your novice path between magician, priest, rogue, and warrior, as well as a few others in supplementary books, but I'll get to those later. Level 2, you have another advancement from your novice path, and then level 3, you choose an expert path. And there are quite a few more here than there are novice paths, which again we'll get into in a bit. Levels 4 to 6, you gain benefits from your past ancestry, novice, and expert choices, and then at level 7, you gain your final path choice, the master path. And then 8 to 10, just like before, you gain advancements from whatever choices you made. If you're wondering why your past paths give you advancements later on and not just in order, such as like levels 1 to 3 are novice path advancements, 4 to 6 are expert, and 7 to 10 are master, is because when you take on a new path, you're not replacing your old paths with a new one. You're adding it to the repertoire of experiences that make up your dynamic and complex character. Now, if this seems confusing to you, don't worry, I will give you a very broad surface level example of making a character, but what I want to stress first as to what I think makes this game stand alone from its counterparts is that it stresses the path choices you make should be based on what happens in the game. And I know you can point to any game like 5e or Pathfinder that show here and there that says like, oh, you should do whatever you want, you should make choices that make sense. But I feel like, and I can't speak for Pathfinder as much because I've only had some experience with it, I've only played it a little bit, but at least for 5e, a lot of the stuff they put in the core book and, you know, the DMG or wherever else, it is there, but it's so easily skipped to just get to where you need to go. Whereas with Demon Lord, it feels like you do really need to read through certain parts. You'll be constantly reinforced with the idea of narrative choices. When you first make your character, there's a bunch of things that they roll on or choose that give your character, you know, all these different aspects of themselves. There are a lot of things throughout the book that tell you to focus on narrative and not just like one chunk somewhere in the book that's easily skippable. And I think it's great that it stresses those narrative elements to the players, but I will say that I do think that can go against how some players work, where some people will just have the most fun getting to make the best builds regardless of narrative. But I do think part of the game ethos that makes it work is trying to encourage even flimsy narrative reasons. If the mage character wants to become more of a fighter, maybe make a retired soldier available to train them, or perhaps during downtime you can summarize or roleplay characters going on side quests or doing side stories where time passes and they gain reasons and feasible ways to take paths that might not make sense from just the main plot you've been running. One thing to keep in mind is that Demon Lord has a big focus on time passing between paths that helps these builds make more sense. But let's get into the broad strokes of a character's path through a campaign. So let's say you're starting at level 1 because you want to start as low-level adventurers already, which is why I would recommend over starting at level 0 anyway. You take the Orc Ancestry path at level 0 and then take the Priest path at level 1. The campaign starts in a small village, you do some adventuring that leads you to the big city where your priest's main religious body is located, and you do some jobs and get further inducted into that religious group. So you decide from your choices from your expert path, you'll keep it simple and go Cleric at level 3. And from there, let's say that this Orc Priest Cleric does a lot of jobs killing demons and ghosts and vile abjurations, so by the time they reach level 7 for the Master path, you again decide to keep it simple and straightforward and go with Exorcist for your master path. Now, I didn't check to see how viable this build is or anything. I just want to make something pretty blunt and straightforward that stayed thematically consistent for the sake of simplicity. But here's the thing. No path has any prerequisites. You don't need a certain amount of points in an attribute to take a path or anything like that. It's not like multiclassing in D&D 5e. The only real prerequisite for choosing a new path if playing the way the game intends is for you to somehow make it make sense narratively from the main plot being told with your group, or working with your GM and discussing what your character does during downtime, or role-playing side sessions with them. So let's get back to that Orc Priest. Let's say that the same story takes them to the big city, but they are met with the reality that the religion they are a part of has been warped and corrupted by the leading clergy, and the Orc Priest has a bit of a mental break and sees the best way to cure this problem is to eradicate the leading clergy members from the face of the earth, and they go around murdering the ones they can in the night. Pretty dramatic shift, I know, just stay with me. So they decide that the Assassin Expert path is what they're going to take instead as a representation of their character change and experience with what they have been doing, and to further their goals. And let's continue the story and say that this corrupt religious organization has also been one that abhors and vilifies technology since it threatens their power structure. So to embody the polar opposite of this organization, the assassin priest decides to go technomancer, or better yet, gunslinger. So now instead of this direct but probably decent build of a powerful holy person, you're a spurned ex-priest gunslinger assassin. And what makes this all come together so well is that it still stays fairly simple. At later levels you might get a bit overwhelmed with everything you have, but every level gives you something so no level feels wasted, but you only get about 1 or 2 changes per level, so you aren't hit with more than you can handle. In the core book, you have 6 ancestry paths, 4 novice paths, 16 expert paths, and 64 master paths. Mix this with 30 magic traditions, and you have almost an endless amount of combinations and builds to play around with. And that is just the core book. There are several companion and supplementary books for this game that have even more ancestries, paths, and magic traditions, so you have an untold number of different builds you can make. And when you start flipping through these books, the ideas you get for what you want to play just start coming to you. Now, we have several more topics to cover here as to why you should play this game and what's so great about it, but I'm gonna be honest. If you're not excited to build a fighter who enhances their martial capabilities with unorthodox magic, or an oracle thief who can look into the future, or any other insane combination you can think of, this game just isn't gonna be for you. So with that said, let's move on to talking about the magic system. The magic system of Demon Lord is really fantastic. I think it finds a great way to blend between the utility style magic of 5e with a more crazy and broken magic system that you might find in other games. As a quick example, in the first campaign I ran, one of the characters, a gross little goblin mage, killed a demon lord and another player by summoning a black hole into existence, sucking them into it, and causing the people and creatures swallowed to just cease to exist. The demon lord didn't go back to the bowels of hell to be reincarnated like they're supposed to. This was a fucking canon event where they were completely erased from the timeline thanks to the spell. It was absolutely insane. I had no idea that they had picked that spell, because at that level I could not keep track of what everybody had, and it was just an incredibly insane moment that I absolutely loved that just had me scrambling for what to do next. The magic system really blends a simple yet potent style that, while structured, still ends up feeling like the characters are dealing with power they can't fully control instead of an RGB toolbox. The spells are all part of traditions that the players choose during certain times when leveling up. These spells all follow the theme of the tradition they are a part of. For example, the fire tradition comprises spells that deal with fire and heat, the time magic tradition deals with time manipulation, precognition, and similar elements, storm magic has to deal with violent weather, and so on and so forth. Some traditions are considered dark magic traditions, such as the curse and necromancy ones. These have the added effect of being hard to find, as well as taking a serious toll on your soul and sanity. Traditions are associated with either intellect or will, as shown on this graph, so some work better for some styles of spellcasters instead of others. Spells fall into 2 types: utility and attack. As the basic naming scheme suggests, attack spells have harmful effects and utility spells have a variety of useful effects. You also get a decent amount of castings per day, which is really nice that even early on, spellcasters can freely use their spells when they feel like they should, and not to worry about hoarding their spells for just the right moment without running into the endless cantrip problem with 5e. They aren't brimming with a million spells or anything like that. There's still like a limited amount of castings, but the amount of spells you get early on really helps that issue. You still have to be conservative to an extent, but you don't have to hoard. I overall don't have an issue with the cantrip system since it fits the level of magic in the D&D 5e world, but I completely understand the criticisms levied against it. The amount of spells you have depends on the amount of power you have, and it is pretty easy to remember by just looking at this graph here. In general, most characters will start with power 0 and can only gain power by taking magical paths. There are other ways to gain power, but for the sake of simplicity, you tend to get 1 power every time you take on a new magic path. This graph shows how many castings per spell you have relative to your power. Let's just start with a level 2 magician. At level 1, they learn 1 tradition and then they can make 3 choices and learn either new spells in that tradition or take on new traditions. Whenever you learn a new tradition, you gain a free level 0 spell, but magicians get an extra level 0 spell for every new tradition they learn, plus they get the sense magic level 0 spell for free as part of taking this path at level 1. At level 2, they can make 2 choices and they can either learn new spells from the traditions they have learned, or they can pick new traditions. Getting some level 1 spells would normally be optimal, but for the sake of being ridiculous, at level 2, including the free sense magic spell, if you took a new tradition for every choice, you could learn 6 vastly different traditions and have a total of 13 level 0 spells at your disposal that you can each cast twice per day. Plus, with the spell recovery ability from the level 2 magician advancement, you can get one of those castings back. Now, I probably wouldn't recommend this unless you had some really good ideas for what you wanted to do with it, and it would make more sense to have fewer traditions but some stronger spells. But that's the thing, you could do what you want, and even if you chose less, you'd still have a shitload. And at level 3, you'd gain another power if you took another magic path, meaning you could cast all those spells 3 times, and you get more to add to your arsenal. The variety of choice means even if you and somebody else both played human magicians, you would have different characters early on, but especially by the time you hit level 3 and start dipping into different magical enhancing abilities and diversity in spells. Or maybe you take a non-magic path at level 3 and use the magic you already have to ameliorate whatever new abilities you gain. The magic system really complements the diverse path system discussed earlier. They interlock into each other to let you build the character you want to make. And just like the paths, there are several supplementary books that add even more magic paths and add optional elements to further deepen the complexity and strength of the magic system. I'm not going to say all magic traditions are created equal because they aren't, but there are so many that sparks inspiration so easily. I like to dabble into different playstyles, but I won't lie, I'm kind of a basic bitch who likes to stress test systems as a fighter or martial type, but the initial simplicity of the magic system that gateways to a wide depth of choice makes me excited to play mage characters more than anything else. And if you know me, I tend to vastly enjoy being a game master more than being a player, so when a system makes me relish the chance to play it instead, that is an insanely good sign of fantastic design. Anyway, time to move on to combat. This section is going to be pretty short because combat here is simple and streamlined. You have your grid-based combat, your characters with actions and movement and all that, but there is something I want to highlight here because I love it, and that is the initiative system and combat structure. Considering how characters in this have a lot of abilities and choice, Shadow the Demon Lord has no right having combat as snappy and satisfying as it is. The combat round is broken into 3 sections: fast turns, slow turns, and end of round. End of round is for players and monster abilities that happen at the structured point and when you deal with dying characters. So, fast and slow turns. Essentially, at the beginning of each round, the players call out if they're making one or the other. The only difference is that a fast turn is just an action, and a slow turn is a movement and an action. There may be some small exceptions that I haven't seen, like the spell requiring a slow turn or a weird ability doing that, but for 99% of the game, that is the only difference. The players do not need to say exactly what they're doing for that turn, they just need to call fast or slow, so they won't get screwed over calling a shot on an enemy that is now dead. Players also decide amongst each other who goes when within those turns. So the way the combat works is player fast turn, enemy NPC fast turn, player slow turn, enemy NPC slow turn, and then end of round. This allows for incredibly satisfying and quick combat to the point where I had players almost getting overwhelmed with how fast the rounds are going with all the choices they had to pick from. This also allows them to engage tactically with each other on their terms. It can be fun having your initiative order all over the place like in 5e or DCC, but it can also suck when the players had a really good plan that they required their rogue to go pretty early on and they rolled a 3 on their initiative. This allows them to decide not only when they go in the structure of the round, but between themselves, which leads to a lot of communication and tactical planning since they are involved in that moment. Genuinely, this is my favorite initiative system for this kind of game. You don't run into the issue of players getting bored waiting for their turn to happen because they're subject to the whims of the dice where they'll get to do their action in like 2 to 3 business days, but are part of the conversation on how everybody should proceed in the moment. You move through both PC and NPC actions so quickly that the every creature rolls a d20 initiative system will be unbearable to go back to once you try this out. As for gameplay itself, actions essentially pertain to what you think they would. There's a list of them in the combat section in the book, from attacking, doubling your movement, stabilizing an ally, and all that. You also have triggered actions, which is like a reaction from 5e where you can use this extra action up to make an attack of opportunity on a fleeing enemy, or you may have spells and abilities that allow you to use a triggered action. When it comes to monsters, you have a fairly solid bestiary in the back of the book. There's some good generic stat blocks to just bolt abilities onto as well as more specific monsters. You'll notice that monsters have a difficulty rating. This is kind of like a CR system, but just like the CR system, I don't really use it and I don't recommend you do either. This is a game where players should run away if they have to and to be smart about any sort of danger that they might run into. Not just going face first into every battle trying to kill everything, even if they can't handle the heat. If you try to balance the monsters they face every time, you will encourage them into fighting instead of finding smarter ways of either engaging them combatively, circumventing them, or trying diplomacy and roguery. Add monsters to your story and world that makes sense for it, not ones that are perfectly balanced for what the characters will face, because then you run into this issue where your world isn't really real, but there to orbit around the player's goals. However, if you are still somebody who can't let go of that, in the GM section there is an in-depth part on how to use the difficulty rating if you're hell-bent on that. In any case, the monsters and creature stat blocks are fairly simple and have strong design and are interesting enemies to deal with. They may still be a bit much for you if you're OSR pilled an old school chord, but they aren't crazy hard to deal with if you just try it instead of giving up the moment you look at it like most people do with Foundry.
Whoa, take it easy, sweetheart.
You have a lot to work with here to make interesting combats, and there are some really fun elements for some of the monsters that I love. For example, Demon Lord doesn't really have crits per se, but it kind of has like an adjacent version of them that can be based on abilities and monsters. Usually these adjacent crits don't require you to roll a natural 20, but usually getting 20 or above, and sometimes a certain amount above. Certain abilities and spells will have an alternate or stronger effect if you roll this high on them. To give you an example of what I mean on the monster side, let's look at the zombie stat block. The zombie stat block has a section here called Headshot. That explains if the total of a weapon attack made against a zombie is 20 or higher, the zombie takes damage equal to its health. I love this so much that mechanically rolling this well destroys the brain like so many people know to do from zombie media. And the zombie, if you look at the stat block, is no pushover, especially in a group. Elements like this that can change the tide of battle also adds to the combat because things on either side can flip fortunes quickly, but they aren't so common that players aren't able to make informed choices, but just adds this tiny pinch of randomness that makes rolling dice fun, and combat sometimes go in really unexpected ways. Anyway, we've covered what I want here. You have plenty of other rules in here, like different kinds of melee and range attacks, cover, items, damage and death rules, amongst other things, but you can look deeper into that yourself because it's time we move on to the final section. Running Shadow of the Demon Lord is much easier than running Pathfinder, 5e, or any of its sibling games. However, it is not without the potential pitfalls and difficulties that all games can run into when trying something new. I definitely had issues here and there when I ran my first 10-session campaign, and though there were learning curves, it is to date one of the best campaigns I ever ran, and it was my first try with it. Obviously, a lot of that needs to be attributed to the players being absolutely incredible and bring some of the best role-playing I've ever seen them do, but we were able to do as well as we did thanks to having a system that complemented our skills and talents instead of fighting them. One of those helpful things is that throughout the book, how you should be running it is established both plainly and through the mechanics. I'm really trying my best not to disparage 5e at every turn, but it's such a perfect example to point to, and in this case, it isn't even 5e's fault. As I mentioned before, once a brand is established a certain way, expectations need to be met. I think when it comes to D&D, this topic needs its own video, but 5e, as successful as it is a victim of its own branding. 5e, at its core, is a monster-killing game with grand narrative packaging. You can argue with the wall about whatever 2-year pacifist game you ran, or political intrigue thriller you did with it. Yes, as it turns out, when you have a medium that is mostly in your head, you can stretch any concept pretty far. I ran a Star Wars one-shot using Call of Cthulhu as the base because I wanted to make some friends happy, and I fucking hate Star Wars. So trust me when I say, I am no stranger to using systems for concepts they are not designed for. There's a lot of nuance here that I need to skip because I want to get back to talking about the game this video is about, but if you look at the mechanics, if you look at what the focus on character advancement is, most of it is combat based on some level or another. And there's nothing wrong with that, because Shadow of the Demon Lord is exactly the same. The difference is, Demon Lord every step of the way understands that that is what it is, and that is why it can lean into the narrative elements so well, so they blend in with the tactical combat so elegantly. As I mentioned, 5e needs as much broad appeal as possible. So they try to tell the old heads that you can do sandbox hex crawls with it, despite so many abilities that PCs get that are designed to bypass survival mechanics as much as possible instead of engaging with them. It's why they tell others that it is a game for telling epic stories and making heroic characters, but you, over there, don't leave because over here are brutal mechanics if you want to play darker, grittier games. D&D has had a mythos around it for a lot longer than 5e about being the game that can do anything and is for everything, even though there have always been fights between people about mechanics and clashes between editions, but again, that's a topic for another time when I feel like angering a whole lot of people. To get back on topic, in this game, its primary goal is to be able to run about 10 session long, give or take a handful of session campaigns, where you go on brutal adventures with hard moral choices and along the way, getting to some amazing and savage fights. The brilliance of shorter campaigns and the focus on that really can't be understated. I already did a video on why people need to play shorter games, so go check that out, but I do really think that this was the game that solidified for me that those 6-month to 3-year campaigns just aren't for me outside of some really special occasions. My first Demon Lord campaign was 10 or 11 sessions and it was perfect. It was incredibly satisfying to have a beginning, middle, and end to a campaign, instead of having it slowly die from the people forgetting what the main story is and why they are even here, or life getting in the way along with my own interest for it becoming non-existent over that long period of time the more we don't finish it. Having a campaign go on for about 2 to 3 months is really nice. Demon Lord uses milestone XP, essentially where you finish certain beats, you level up. And generally you should be doing a story beat basically every 4-hour session or so, but if that is too fast paced, which it was for me at times, it's easy just to stretch it out. So if you find that 10 sessions is too short, it is literally the simplest game in the world to make longer because you just make the story beats longer, or you just level up the players when you feel like it. I know some people hate milestone XP, but it's just like gold for XP or any other XP system. You just need to use it right. Milestone XP works great for the style of plot-forward gaming. If you want to do Monster XP, I'm sure people online have made it for this game and you can use that. There are interesting conversations to be had about how XP systems change the way players interact with the game, but the blind vitriol towards 5e has made some people hate Milestone XP purely by association, instead of just realizing that it doesn't work for the types of games that they want to play. But I genuinely recommend, before you decide you're going to change everything, to just try what the base game expects you to do. In 10 sessions, I was able to pack so much great content, drama, hilarity, epic epic moments and fantastic times, and by the time we were done, we were super pleased and satisfied with how the campaign played out. This is only a few of the things we were able to do in 10 sessions, but the players had their own hometown burned down by a demon and had to survive an undead army overrunning it. They had to help Ratfolk refugees in the Underdark. They cleared out a haunted villa and claimed it as their own. They broke a siege and saved a commander from it, stopped a cult from growing demon spawn underneath the capital city. They communed with an eldritch being, and they did several more things, but you get the idea. I was able to pack in so much fun content. I think a good analogy is video games. I'm at a point now where I'm really burned out on 100-hour open world games, unless they're the best of the best, like Baldur's Gate 3 and Witcher 3, or, Yakuza Like a Dragon, or whatever else. When a game advertises that it's like 18 times the size of Skyrim, it has 2,000 hours of content and all that, I just feel a deep fatigue in my soul. I'm not in high school anymore where all I can afford is a few games over time and I have endless energy where I can play these games that give me a nice big heaping ladle of content with the nutritional value of cardboard. What I like these days are games like Resident Evil Village. I paid full price and got a 12-hour curated experience with amazing set pieces, really satisfying gameplay, and full of properly crafted content that made the full price tag worth it. I don't want games where I'm running forever in beautiful but empty environments that all feel the same so I can climb towers over and over and churn through content and have a mediocre experience for most of it, just to get a few good moments because I neither had the time nor think that design is very good or fun. And that is what a 5e 2-year-long campaign is versus a Demon Lord campaign. They might start out really great and full of energy and all these fantastic, amazing moments, but eventually I have found for the most part, and obviously there's so many experiences of people who don't have that, but for my own experience, I find eventually they turn into a slog to trudge through, are not nearly as fun as just having a really great 2 to 3 month curated experience with insane moments that keeps everybody engaged and entertained. And if you're thinking that you can do that with 5e, you're absolutely right. After our first Demon Lord campaign, my friend wanted to run Curse of Strahd as his final campaign before taking a break from RPGs, and he ran it in 5e in 10 episodic sessions, and it was the absolute best way to experience a 5e Grand Campaign. I will get him on at some point to talk about that because it genuinely fixed the 5e Grand Campaign problem, but I keep getting sidetracked. You can do this stuff in other games, but this game is designed around that idea, and it works the best in it, and the mechanics are aimed at you creating these 10-session or so campaigns for your group. One thing I don't think Schwalbe gets enough credit for is his GM advice in his book. He gets a lot of credit for his awesome design skills, but his writing style is really informal in a way that is easy to read, but not annoying and quippy. Sometimes the biggest roadblock for some people can be how dry some of these pretty books you buy or read, so having a writing style to read that rolls smoothly is really nice. Just take this part for instance. Steal liberally. When preparing a game and while running it, don't be afraid to steal anything and everything you can. Think about cool places you've visited or seen in magazines or websites and fill your world with such locales. Draw on stories and adventures from other games, characters from books and films, science fiction or fantasy, comics, even a TV commercial, whatever makes you excited. Steal ideas that are amazingly cool or nightmarishly awful. All these things can be the seeds of great stories. Plant them in your game and watch them grow into wonderful, terrifying, strange, and memorable experiences. Now, obviously, for a lot of you people who are veterans, a lot of stuff is not going to be necessarily new to you, but the GM section is full of gems for new GMs, and is really helpful for running this game, and I think would go a long way in running similar games like Pathfinder and 5e, so I highly recommend checking it out, because there's a lot of great stuff there if you're always looking for, new takes or new people saying things about the hobby and how to run stuff. I've been bouncing around the place a little bit here in this section, so I'm just going to try and nail down some advice for you GMs from my own experience. Firstly, be kind to yourself. I'm going to start adding this a lot more in my videos, but don't be so hard on yourself if you stumble a bit with the new rules, longer stat blocks, and diverse player abilities. I think I'm also adding this because I feel like I see way too many new people on Discord get discouraged when they're excited or earnest questions get slapped down by the rudest and most dismissive people who need to make sure you know their opinion. Running a new game takes time to adapt, and if you have good players, they'll understand that. In my first campaign, I several times underestimated the abilities of my players, and they absolutely curb stomped some of my combats. One that comes to mind was when they were tasked to go into enemy territory and return power to a pump house so that the city could have fresh water again. And I had the beastmen guarding it surround them, and they just threw down some environmental spells and worked together and beat the fucking shit out of those poor beastmen so badly, I nearly called the SPCA on them. Thing is, with a game like this, you just need to calibrate both on the fly, but also don't be afraid to just let your players have some wins sometimes. I was painting minis and building stories for that campaign. Sometimes at the time game day arrived, I did not have enough brainpower to make the most tactically sound fights, but I always learned for next time, which led to some pretty scary, intense combats. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about how this game tries to have shorter campaigns and the focus on interesting encounters and strong moments, with that in mind, feel free to skip whatever you want. If you want a story beat to be traveling across the mountains to get to the Jarl's war camp where the players have to face an abominable snowman and the treacherous conditions, go for it. But if you don't think you can make that interesting or are not interested in it, do not feel like you need to do it. Hand over with a few sentences and start the scene with them in the war camp because they have a cool mission to do with, I don't know, saving the Jarl's son or, attacking recon units or whatever it is, where you have a cool idea for the players and what you think is more interesting. I know that sounds obvious, but I just like to reinforce the advice of do whatever the fuck you want. You know your group better than anybody, so if you know they just like fighting monsters, then crack out the beer and pretzels and give them a gauntlet. Don't worry about people like me telling you that they absolutely 100% need to have a narrative reason for their path choices or the things they do. I want that in my games. But if you don't, you're not in the wrong because everybody in your group just wants to min-max and kill things and not worry about anything else. If everybody's having a good time, keep doing what you're doing. If they aren't, then that is when to look at how you may need to change how you're running the game or what game you're running or things like that. But until then, skip the travel section, lower the amount of combat, tune up the amount of lore dumps, and whatever is working for you and your group. I mention that mostly to push back on a lot of the videos and posts I see online of people talking with like an objective tone about what players and GM should do. It's always good to try and improve. One of the best parts about a hobby is that you can improve yourself. You can feel like you're getting better at a skill. It can be a really fun thing to do. But if you're getting stressed out, or if you're getting imposter syndrome, or if you're feeling bad about yourself, then just fuck that stuff. And like I said, if you're having fun and everybody's at the table is having a fun time, you're doing great and keep doing what you're doing. One thing I recommend for this game as well is to take advantage of the different tech levels of the base setting. Even if you don't use the base setting, which is essentially Warhammer Fantasy at home, it can be really fun to shake off the medieval fantasy vibes and try out guns and steam engines and all kinds of crazy stuff that can really change how the game world feels. I feel like a lot of people, myself included with my upcoming actual play, are getting more interested in the Knights with Guns aesthetic or the Magitech vibe and just the interesting changes that you can bring to your world if you get past just regular old medieval fantasy and start diving into, a higher tech level and what that might mean for the societies in your game and the people and how that sort of changes things. If you are looking to run a campaign of this and you don't want to go off of one of the pre-made adventures, but you're not sure what you'd like the big picture story to be, then you should check out the Shadow of the Demon Lord mechanic in the book. Put simply, this mechanic in essence is a huge crisis to have for your game. There's some lore stuff on it, but essentially it's a mechanic around the ramping up of chaos or whatever rising tension and conflict that can drive a campaign. What matters is that this can give whatever flavor of antagonism you want for your campaign, and you can work backwards pretty easily from that. Keep in mind that a lot of these are exceptionally grimdark, so depending on what you're doing with the system, you may need to tweak it a bit. I haven't really touched on it, but the game is designed for much more bleak fantasy gaming, but it is honestly not hard to reflavor this to be more in line with lighter fantasy. Shadow of the Weird Wizard is coming out, and it is attempting to be that gray fantasy, as the game calls it, where it's a bit less bleak than this one, but personally, if I want to run this to be more in line with the regular 5e game tone, it would take next to no work in my opinion. I know people disagree with that, but I don't know what to tell you. It's pretty easy just to reflavor or remove certain things and be totally fine. Back to the Shadow of the Demon Lord mechanic. Some of the example crises are the sun turning black, a global beastman curse, an elder dragon awakening, fall civilization, and several more. The diversity in ideas is actually so damn nice because once you read some of these, you will immediately get ideas for what kinds of campaigns you could run. For example, let's take the Elder Dragon Awakening that is destroying cities and civilization. You can open the campaign with the players losing their home, having to escape flame and destruction, avoid looters, and whatever crazed degenerates take advantage of a crisis like this, and maybe also try to save some people. It's an easy setup for drama, combat, set pieces, etc. From there, you can follow a storyline that there is some dragon cult that brought this to fruition, and through cutting them down, you gain knowledge about what happened, information on the dragon, and maybe a weapon that can stop it. This can easily lead to a faction play between whatever remaining players of humanity think they deserve the weapon, what they do next, and all the while needing to restore what is left of humanity. Is anything I'm giving you original? Not really, but I think it would make for a really fun campaign if you play it out, and that is just one way you could play it. Another way would be that maybe the dragon awakens and destroys most of civilization, and then dies or is killed by a band of heroes, but this has caused the setting to become essentially a nuclear fantasy apocalypse with titanic pockets of necrotic magic where the dragon attack creating fallout zones. Maybe also in its revival or death, it causes a shitload of mortals to have a magical awakening, so that you have this apocalypse mixed with a bunch of people with new powers, using them for good and bad, creating a power imbalance from tensions between old power structures meeting the new ones. Honestly, I came up with this while writing the script, and I actually really want to run this now. I think this would be a really, really fun actual play to do. But yeah, you can come up with so many ideas for each of these, so they are really great places to look at to plant the seed of creativity where the rest of the campaign can blossom from. My last piece of advice is that if you can, try to keep track of what your players can do. That will be so helpful for making fun encounters. This is a game where you will eventually not be able to keep track, but just trying to learn what their big moves are can help you create situations where the players can both shine and be challenged. I had trouble with this at first with how fast the game moved with the players leveling every session, because by the time I learned their abilities, they did have new ones. Not knowing what your players can do can possibly create situations on both sides, ranging from tediously difficult tasks to making tasks that you thought were going to be a fun challenge completely trivial. This is something you will get better at the more you play, but feel free to slow down their leveling speed if you can't keep up, or design monsters that don't penalize the players, but have traits that foil them so they have to get creative. Okay, I think that's enough about this game. If you're not convinced yet about how awesome this game is, then it probably just isn't for you. In conclusion, it is a wonderful vessel for telling memorable, emotional, and epic stories in smaller campaigns designed around highlighting these stories rather than dragging them out. With this, your players can make the characters they want either through sheer build crafting or growing alongside them through experience and choices with the stories they tell, making unique and cool characters from a vast array of paths mixed with an absolute arsenal of magic to choose from. All this wrapped up in a book brimming with streamlined and well-crafted mechanics, married with priceless GM tips that can help you with this game, as well as be helpful for running games in general. I might try to get more videos out, or I might do a stream on Shadow the Weird Wizard, but the production at the time of this video seems to be all over the place. Layout seems a bit wonky, and it seems like they'll be making some big changes to the PDF already released or something like that, so I'd rather not go over it and have it be out of date within a month. The quick play got taken down the day after I talked about it last time, so I'll give it some time before I go over it. If you have played Demon Lord or end up playing it, please let me know about some of your most memorable moments. As always, I love hearing your stories and seeing what this awesome community has experienced through the hobby. I want to say a big thanks to my patrons for both supporting me and voting on this video topic. It means a lot, and you guys are great and have allowed me to continue doing this. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, and stay safe out there.